So how did it come about then? Did you pitch it yourself, or were you approached because of your background in the Box of Delights?
No, I mean, often these things can come together in different ways. On this occasion, I pitched and said, I run a company called Moon Balloon Productions, and I often work with the BBC. They commission me, they give my production company a budget to make a film, and then I deliver it to the BBC. And on this occasion, I said to them, you should do a Narnia set. So that the set has come through that suggestion, and I think one of the reasons they wanted to do it was because we could make with that a big giant all singing or dancing documentary that gives you a reason. Not only will the episodes be on that set of all four stories of all three seasons, restored and remastered and looking and sounding nicer than they have before. Uh, and also the special features that have previously been on the DVDs are ported over. But, you've got a 2-hour, 10-minute documentary that really takes a full look at it. And hopefully, you kind of I hope that come November 24th when it comes out on Blu-ray and DVD, available for pre-order now on Amazon places. I hope
Get the
that people
plug in.
will get the plug, but I hope that people will enjoy it because it's been a labor of love from my point of view, and I would do it for free, and I would do it, kind of even if nobody was going to watch it, I'd do it. But it's nice to get the bonus that maybe people will watch it and hopefully they'll enjoy it.
And at the point you pitched it, Chris, did you have any of the casting crew already signed up?
No, so I had nothing. I had nothing because you can't really. There's only so far you can go with that approach because it getting people on board takes weeks and weeks of quite involved negotiation and discussion, and there's only so far you can go with that. So I went in very much with a knowledge that we could do this, that we were capable of doing it, and an awareness of who was in the world. That's the important thing. If you pitch something where, sadly, maybe the cast, maybe it's an older piece and the cast aren't around, the crew aren't around, you think, well, who are we going to interview? And then you think, well, where can we go? And actually in Narnia's case, it's got an embarrassment of riches in terms of the people you can speak to, the places you can go to. So I always thought what I wanted to build it around was a sense of reunions on location that acts as a spine for the documentary. So I always said what I pitched it with is this notion of we have to begin with the four Pevensey siblings, with the grown-up actors returning to the professor's house. So just in the same way that they arrive as evacuees, in a way, I think it's the most famous thing in the books or the TV or the film is that image of arriving at a house, at a huge house, exploring the rooms and finding a wardrobe upstairs. I think that's the most vivid moments in any of the books, for me, and the thing that I think when children in particular think of Narnia, and I wanted to begin it with the four of them back in that place as grown-ups, revisiting, going up those stairs again, opening up creaky doors again. That was really important to me, and the logic at that stage was thinking almost like a relay race, because you can't, with our Box of Delight stock, we kept with the main actor and the director all the way through because they're all the way through the Box of Delights. But in Narnia's case, I wanted it to be a celebration of all four stories. I didn't want to get distracted entirely by Lion the Witch. It needed to be a film that also celebrated Caspian and Dawn Treader and Silverchair. So we give them all, I hope, kind of equal love and respect. So that meant the structure of the film had to be a relay race. It had to be a film that ideally begins with your four Pevensey siblings back on location. I knew we don't have the money or the schedule to be able to take them around multiple locations. So picking one big iconic location per story, so to take them back to the professor's house and build that around that, to have a Prince Caspian section where we reunite them with young Prince Caspian, with Jean-Marc Perret and Aslan's How, Hawkston Park Grotto. From that is such an unbelievable location where the stone archway from that story is, which feels like something out of New Zealand. It's like genuinely this incredible rocky outcrop in the middle of the English countryside.
It looked beautiful. It looked beautiful when I was coming back from Pembroke. The idea was to go to Hoxton Park, but unfortunately it was closed. I was so gutted. But yeah,
I'd recommend it. I'd recommend it. And what I hadn't realized is that all the scenes inside the caves in Prince Caspian are also at Hawkston Park. That they're basically underneath that's how is the grotto, the cave structure that you see in that story with a lot of the Caspian scenes and so on. And then with Dawn Treader, I kind of wanted to actually my idea would have been to go back on the Dawn Treader. The Dawn Treader's built onto it was a real ship that they really went to see it. This is an incredible part of that production. They really built it, and they built it on top of an existing sail ship called the Carry. And I thought, let's get them back on that. Let's get Sam West, and let's get Jonathan Scott, who plays Edmund, and Sophia Wilcox, who plays Lucy. Let's get them back on that ship. And unfortunately, that ship sank off the Irish coast in the early noughties in a quite nefarious way. It seems like not everybody was keeping watch on the night that it went down while it was being used for the filming of a reality TV show, strangely enough. But I found a good solution to that, and we took them back to Plasnewydd, which is the magician's house where we see the Duffelbuds in the story, which you'll have seen in the publicity photos we put out. And finally, for Silverchair, we had David Thwaites, who plays Eustace, and Camilla Power, who plays Jill, back on location at Haddon Hall, which is the giant's castle, Horfang, isn't it, in the story? Which actually, interestingly, I think is a location they never visited the first time around because they were miniaturized and in the studio when they're on location there. So actually, that was a nice way of saying you never got to see it in 1990, but now's your chance, you know. And so to build a film around those 4 extended reunions with 26, as we ended up with interviewees, all kind of coming off from the points to deepen and go into detail on it. And none of that was known at the outset at the pitching. You just have to think, well, we'll be okay. But it was very much a process of speaking to those people and assuring them that we weren't psychopaths and that we were going to, treat what they did with respect. But also it was going to be fun. It was going to be a nice way of reconnecting with something that I think for the whole cast and crew had a very special place in their hearts. So it's been really lovely.
Amazing, amazing. And that list of locations that you've just spoke about, certainly for me, when I went to Pembroke and Manorbier, I felt a real sort of sense of belonging in a weird way because you're sort of, as I said to you before, this series became a bit of a comfort blanket. I wonder if you had any of those emotions when you rocked up at, especially the house. That's in Wales as well, isn't it? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It's down towards the south border of Wales. I can never pronounce the name. It's called Llanfihangel Court is the name of the house, and they use it for weddings and things like that now. No, I mean, beautiful locations. And when you go into that house, the wonderful thing about dealing with a house like that is the part of the job of maintaining a place like that is to keep it the way it was. So this house has not been modernized like my grandparents' house might have been by the awful people who moved in there after they died. But in this case, you've got a beautiful house that has basically been kept exactly the way it looked in 1988. So you can wander up those stairs. What I didn't realize, I don't want to give too many spoilers about the film, but what I didn't realize is that although when you watch that episode, quite clearly the wardrobe is on a studio set, even though the staircases are on location. But when you go up into the real attic in that house, it suddenly dawns on you that they've based the studio set exactly on the attic that's there in the real house. And they couldn't go up and film in there for safety reasons at the time. It was unsafe. And I think the practicalities of having a wardrobe without a back that you could film through that in a studio in a way you can't really on location. So you suddenly just start discovering all these different nuggets, and then realizing how beautiful Auxton Park is. Plasnewydd, the inside of the magician's house, the scenes I remember very vividly from Dawn Treader when Lucy goes inside and they use this kind of very creepy fisheye lens as she's going up the stairs to kind of warp the wooden walls.
Yes.
You go into that place and it's exactly like that, like without the fisheye lens, but it's a beautiful carved wooden environment. Um,
Did you dig
and
your fisheye lens out to shoot it in the same way?
we're nice and wide, certainly. I wanted to keep it
Love
real.
that.
We don't go crazy fisheye, but we had our widest lens on for that, and and so I think the locations hopefully give it a scale and mean that we can fly drones and add color that you wouldn't have if it was just talking heads. and green screens. And I love a talking head. I think often I watched the John Candy documentary the other day that they've just put out, which is all talking heads, but completely charming. And sometimes that's the absolute best way to tell a story. And that's what we do with all of our 26 interviewees. Is we interviewed them all on their own, but then you have these huge big scenes where certain cast members kind of come back together, and that also means that people, that we can make sure that even if it's me just jumping in my car and going to interview someone for a couple of hours, at the 11th hour in our production, they can still be in the film. We can
Mm.
still draw it in. It's very helpful.
And so in terms of your crew, was it times just yourself then?
The thing to remember, and hopefully when you see the film, this would be a good thing, is we are dealing on a micro budget. We are making films for about 10% of the budget they would have for TV. If it was a primetime UK broadcast, which, is what I normally work on, we're going at 10% of that. So when we're doing interviews, it's normally just me, and I'll visit somebody at home, and I'll set up camera and lights and sound, and I'll one man it. And when we're on location, we're shooting things that I think look like a proper feature film, but we're doing it with a crew of 3. We're doing it with 2 cameras cross-shooting, myself on camera A, a lady called Claire Gould on camera 2, and camera B. Claire is flying drones for us in between those shots, and we have a runner, who's there to help people get around and to bring in lunch and so on, and to be generally incredibly helpful. So it's a very small team. But I hope that you wouldn't know that to watch it. I think if anything, it gives it more intimacy with the casts that you're filming with. It doesn't feel like a big film crew has turned up and
Big up,
taken.
big up, Claire, and your runner. I noticed when you
I
were
remember, I should say, we were going to name check them, then Izzy, Abigail, and Guy are our 3 runners who were there across different days of the whole thing.
thank you to those guys for making this such a success. Um, were there any? I noticed you had on your Instagram the things you've been posting been incredible. I noticed you had a particularly good fun when you were meeting with Kerry Shell and Leslie Nichol.
Yeah.
You described them as 2 of your favourite people actually. After you'd spent some time with them, what was it that gave you such a good feeling about those 2?
Well, I think Narnia's got such a lovely guest cast, and we always knew that we wanted to build it around the core casts of basically the child actors. Basically the grown-up child actors. I think there's something really profound if you're in your middle age, if you're in your 40s or 50s, and you're looking back on childhood. Particularly when your childhood was on the telly and everybody came up and asked you about it afterwards. I think that's pretty amazing and means that they remember it very vividly. But we were lucky that the supporting cast in all 4 stories is really rich and interesting. And with Lion the Witch in the Wardrobe, you've got Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. I know the Beavers get some stick for being big. I love the Beavers. I will defend the Beavers. And I think Kerry Shale, who's in Wednesday the other day, I don't know if you saw him playing, he plays a driving instructor. He gives Wednesday driving lessons and he gets killed, spoilers, and turns into a zombie. But I was like, it's Kerry Shale. And obviously Leslie Nichol is now incredibly famous for being the cook in Downton Abbey. But at this point, early on in their career, they're just like jobbing actors, very talented people, and they had a very profoundly positive experience on Narnia and had kept in touch with cast members. But at the time, were very hot and sweaty inside of beaver costumes in the studio, but quite warm and snug on location in the snow in Scotland. So they were just very, very, very funny, delightful people who could see the funny side of falling over on their asses, from time to time in the beaver costumes. I think they saw the funny side of that. But we knew that, we needed to make sure that we had the key personnel involved, and with Lion the Witch, you know, I wanted Mr. and Mrs. Beaver definitely, but I knew that if we didn't have Barbara Kellerman coming back as the White Witch, I mean, Barbara is such a force of nature in that show. The White Witch is still the one I think of with that character, and uh, Barbara was very interesting because she was almost impossible to find. Like she dropped off the BBC's radar. So even I think in terms of residual payments for DVDs being sold, I've had to reconnect her to them to make sure that she's getting that, because she'd I think
Oh.
quite intentionally taken a step back and said, actually, I'm just going to have a lovely life and not worry about TV things. Very sensible. But finding her, we didn't find her until really the 11th hour in the production, and that was via a good friend of mine called Alex Moore, who found out who a family member of hers was. So somebody in the public eye who's related to Barbara, who we were able to contact through their publicly available contact, and they were very happy to pass on an email to Barbara. And then really within 3 days of speaking to Barbara on the phone, I was at her house filming an interview with her. And that was only about 2 weeks before the end of our production. That was really tight. And there could very easily be a version of the film that doesn't have Barbara in it. She didn't have to say yes. I'm so glad she did, because she's, I think, hilarious and very warm and charming and quite naughty as well, quite prepared to be, provocative and thoughtful in a really interesting way. And equally the same is true for the young cast. I mean, there's no contractual obligation for any of these people to come back and do a film looking back at the beginning of their careers, and they could easily say no to us, and we don't have the budget to be able to kind of convince people just by throwing money at the situation. So it relies on their generosity to some extent, and quite easily with the four Pevensey children, any one of them could have decided not to do it. And it certainly wasn't a done deal at the beginning that they would all do it. We could have been wandering around the professor's house with 2 or 3 of the siblings, and we all agree that would be incredibly sad and incredibly rubbish for the film. But, talking to Richard Dempsey, who's Peter, Sophie Wilcox, who's Lucy, Sophie Cook, Susan, and Jonathan Scott, Edmund, all of those guys had really retained a friendship over the years. I think at some points they've had a WhatsApp group, like a Pevensey WhatsApp group, with the 4 of them, just talking about normal things, not talking about Narnia in the slightest. That would be crazy. And, the trust that they've placed in us to be able to do this, and actually the friendships that we formed making the film, I think, I really treasure that, because their chemistry as kind of fake siblings, if you like, I think they've become genuine siblings really over the years, through their connection in Narnia. So having them involved, crucial. And then I think to pepper everything else with key guest parts. When you come into Caspian, we've already set up in the film Aslan's story, and we have Vin Burnham, who designed Aslan, who was also the designer of like the Michael Keaton Batman costume, like a year after she did Narnia. So having Vin involved, having William Todd Jones, who's from the Jim Henson kind of club, basically, who's the back half of Aslan, Elsa Burke, who's also a Jim Henson alumni, as the front half of Aslan, Tim Rose, who did the animatronics, and also very casually will say, yeah, I'd come off like Dark Crystal and Labyrinth and Return of the Jedi, and then I had to do Aslan, and he's like, holy shit, that's amazing. Um, so people like that, and then with Caspian, to have Jean-Marc Perret come back in and talk about young Caspian. When we're doing Dawn Treader, to have Samuel West, who I know off telly from all sorts of things, and so to have Sam come in and talk about being King Caspian is interesting, with David Thwaites, who plays Eustace. And Eustace is such an interesting, like Edmund is such a fascinating part, and Eustace kind of continues that vein of a character that you're not very keen on. You're not supposed to like Eustace, are you? And then he comes round, and he changes, and you love him. And David has had a really interesting time since Narnia. He became a Hollywood producer. He produced Black Swan, with Natalie Portman. So he's been at the Oscars as a movie producer, and he produced the Halloween reboots that they did around 2018 with Jamie Lee Curtis. So you go, that's amazing. And I think
Incredible.
he would say there's a connection that kind of that first taste of a big budget kind of fantasy world in Narnia inspired him to think about behind the scenes stuff. And by amazing coincidence, David was back in the UK on a family holiday, on an extended like kind of trip back to see various family members at the time that we were filming. And we could say, we would have arranged something in the States, but we couldn't have had him back on location. We haven't got really the budget to bring him over, especially to come on back on location. But because he was in the country, we could reunite him with Camilla Power, with Jill Pole, and have them back at Haddon Hall. And then to have Camilla, to have Jill. I think Jill Pole's such a great part, and she's so good in Silverchair. But then we film with people like Nick Brimble, who's the giant porter in Silverchair, and I know him as like Little John in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves with Kevin Costner, although he's got a big beard, big bushy beard in that. And people like kind of like Richard Henders, who plays Prince Rilian in Silverchair, and he's so scary I remember as a kid being really terrified of what he does in that. So it's a really rich cast that we can go into, and that's only half of it, because then we wanted to represent the crew as well. And Marilyn Fox, the director of Land of the Witch, is no longer with us, sadly, passed away in the early noughties. But Alex Kirby directed the other 3 stories and set up people like Alan, or sorry, like Alex, and people like Alan Spaulding, who designed all 4 stories. People like Tony Harding, who did visual effects on the latter 3. There's a real depth, hopefully, to the kind of recollections that you'll get. It's not just actor kind of lovey stories and so on. Love a lovely story, but it's kind of special effects and production and all that stuff.
And so we get to hear from Alex Kirby in the doc.
Everybody that I've just mentioned, everybody that
That is incredible.
is in the book, and then there's more beyond that, because you're talking about 26 people, and we can't really get, you can't get everybody that you want for these things, but we've got 95% of the people that I set out to get, and for something like this, nearly 40 years on, I'm very, very happy with how it's turned out.
It's so interesting how you speak there about David Thwaites, and I guess that would have been a really formative time in his life, in relation to what he's gone on and done in his career. Was there any other cast and crew reactions when they revisited that time in their life, that it seemed like it moved them?
I think so. I think so. I mean, I think of it makes me think of Jonathan Scott, who plays Edmund, and I think anybody playing Edmund, it's a very complicated character, and I think that for a lot of those child actors, they became teenagers, they became grown-ups, and you don't always want to be reminded of this thing you did when you were a kid. Particularly in Jonathan's case, it's a character who can be seen as quite a negative character, even though it's arguably the best character in the whole story. Um, and I think for all of them, I think they've probably very understandably gone through a time of wishing people would probably shut up about about Narnia. But I think as you reach the middle of your life, as you become a parent, in I think many of their cases, uh, I think you soften to that kind of thing. And so for all of them, I think it was very emotional to come back to. And I think being on location. The other thing that I'm very keen on, that we did also in the Box of Delights doc, is artifacts. I think mementos are very important. And if you can say this thing, this physical object, survives from the thing you did 40 years ago, it shouldn't survive, but it does. I think we were very keen, and we have an awful lot of props and very unique items. There's no such thing as very unique, is there? But unique items from Narnia that we're able to reconnect the cast with on camera. And I won't tell you about any of those, but there are lots of them in the film. And lots of things that you wouldn't think should have survived, but they have, because the people making the show really knew this is something special, we should photograph it, we should keep stuff, and that is very beneficial to documentary makers turning up 40 years down the line.